You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 24th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme, we discuss Ukraine's European Union accession bid as stakeholders prepare for discussions tomorrow. We'll examine spreading violent extremism in the Sahel region, and we'll have a roundup of the Latin American papers with Fernando Augusto Pacheco. What do you have for us, Faye?
Hello, Georgina. Today we look at Milei's controversial tour in Europe, and it's not all about the Euros, it's also Copa America.
Thank you very much, Fernando. And finally...
We are very spoiled in Switzerland. We have this marvelous system, and people wouldn't believe that you can actually live in a country without having a car.
We'll hear all about the super efficient Swiss public transport network. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. Ukraine and Moldova are one step closer to joining the European Union as tomorrow formal accession talks begin. Well, Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze is a Ukrainian MP and chair of the Committee on Ukraine's integration into the European Union, and she joins me now. Ivanna, many thanks for coming on the show. I wonder how significant the timing of this is, given that it just squeaks in before Hungary takes over the revolving presidency of the EU.
Hello, thank you for having me. And you are already kind of answering your question that it was so important that Belgian presidency would make sure that gets everybody from the European Council on board in order to have this decision accomplished and approved before the Hungarian presidency. Hungarian presidency has already outlined its priorities for the next half of the year, and that those ones unfortunately do not include any progress for Ukraine or Moldova on our European integration track. So we are grateful to Belgian presidency and to all others who have been pushing forward this consensus that is important so that the negotiation framework will be approved tomorrow.
So Ukraine's been on this track for some time. I wonder if you could explain to us what steps have to be taken for the country to join the EU.
Well, we've been in this process for some time, definitely since the time we wanted to sign the association agreement, that with the refusal of then authorities of Ukraine to sign it has led to the revolution of dignity. And fortunately, it also then provoked or not provoked, or was used by the Russian Federation rather to attack Ukraine back in 2014. But since then, we have been carrying out the association agreement. But since the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation, we have upscaled this process and have applied for the candidate status. And we are grateful that there was a merit-based but still very much politically motivated decision of the EU to grant us that status, and that decision has been accompanied by a number of very serious and very specific conditions. So we have fulfilled all of them since June 2022, and now we are in the next step of the formal negotiations start tomorrow. That means that we are going into very both technical, bureaucratic, but also political process of first screening of our legislation with regard to its compatibility and compliance to the EU legislation, and then prioritizing those clusters or specific chapters that we will be opening in order to get through the transformation of the country to be fully compatible and in full compliance to the EU regulations. I think that is a lengthy period, as we have learned from many other countries from their experience, but it's also a light at the end of the tunnel for Ukrainian people who are not only hoping that we will have the possibility to get to the strategic goals of EU and NATO membership, but also we are doing this on the backdrop of the most brutal and terrible war that is happening on the European continent since World War II.
I wonder why Moldova's bid was included with that of Ukraine, and if Moldova is held up for any reason, will that impact on Ukraine?
Well, all the waves of the EU enlargement have been usually happening in inclusion of some countries, not one specific country, as a rule. And as Moldova has been also prioritizing this process for itself, and has been also moving on that track, the decision has been made that both Ukraine and Moldova will be kind of going in both competition, but in concert together, so to say. Definitely, the process and progress in one of the countries will be, to an extent, impacting another one, but it's not, linked it's not cemented in this link. So if someone is doing better, so that country will progress faster.
I wonder how Ukrainians view potential membership of the EU.
Well, at this point, we have incredible support of the public, probably up to like 88-90%, according to different sociological polls. And I think it will be very, very important to preserve this public support. And that's not necessarily an easy ride, because we also understand that some of the decisions will be pretty difficult. And that means that the government, the parliament, all the stakeholders would have to take it to a very open and honest public conversation and explanatory work in order for everybody to understand that maybe in the short run some of the decisions will be painful, but they in the mid to long term will provide Ukrainians with additional opportunities.
And how optimistic are you about the talks tomorrow and the process as a whole?
Well, definitely, I am very optimistic with regard to tomorrow, because the decision basically on the level of the ambassador has been already taken. So tomorrow it will be official, formal start of these negotiations. I don't expect any, hurdles for tomorrow. But with regard to the process, that will definitely depend on very many things, both the internal capacity of transformation here in Ukraine, the political will, the engagement and inclusiveness of that process here internally, but also it is a two-way street, so it will also depend on the readiness and capacity of the EU to fully engage with Ukraine and to provide very quickly the feedback on different things that Ukraine will be doing. But definitely, besides all of this, the practicalities of the process, we also understand that the war and the Russian aggression is going to continuously present additional incredibly difficult challenge to this process. And that's why the first and foremost goal for us is to ensure that we are defeating the aggressor state that is trying to ruin the whole international law, or rather the remnants of the international law, and making sure that Ukraine is victorious in this process and can focus exclusively on transformation and recovery.
And just finally, are you expecting some kind of reaction from Russia to this specific event tomorrow?
I'm sure that we will hear some of the statements from some Russian officials, but I think that it's important that we would not only declare altogether that Russia does not have a say in or any other third country does not have a say in the developments of Ukraine or our relationship with the EU or our relationship with NATO, but actually ensure that they don't have a say. So whatever Russia says, I do not care, because this is about the choice of the Ukrainian people. This is about our willingness to return to civilized world to which we belong, and just to make sure that with regard to our laws, procedures, our practices inside, we are creating a state that is strong and can be only a powerful addition to the EU.
Thank you very much, Ivanna. That was Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze. Now, here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. At least 16 people have been killed in South Korea following a massive factory fire that began after several lithium batteries exploded. The blaze broke out on Monday morning at a plant some 45 kilometers south of Seoul. About 100 workers were on the premises at the time. Local fire officials say it remains unclear what triggered the initial explosions. Fresh protests have flared up in the French Pacific territory of New Caledonia after 7 independence activists were flown to mainland France for pre-trial detention. They're accused of having links to a group believed to have orchestrated the deadly riots last month. The overnight unrest saw buildings set on fire, including a police station and a town hall. U.S. prosecutors have recommended the Department of Justice bring criminal charges against Boeing. It follows a claim the plane maker had violated a settlement related to 2 fatal crashes involving its 737 MAX aircraft, which killed 346 people. Boeing has previously denied violating the deferred prosecution agreement. The DOJ has 2 weeks to make a final decision on whether to prosecute. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Laura. A new report by the Dutch research think tank Clingendael Institute warns that a large violent extremism problem has emerged in northwest Nigeria that now threatens Benin. Well, joining me to discuss this is Kars de Bruin, who is a senior research fellow with the Clingendael's Conflict Research Unit and head of the Sahel programme. Kars, many thanks for coming on the show. Could you tell us about the recent developments of violent extremism in both the Sahel and Nigeria?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a really important question indeed. If we look first at the Sahel, generally we've seen that violent extremism as a problem has spiraled out of control since 2012. And particularly the last 2-3 years, we see that in Burkina Faso and Niger, the violent extremist groups move further and further south. And since 2021, we've seen that they've moved into Benin, mainly in the north of Benin. The group mainly is called JNIM. There is some presence likely of an IS affiliate. So that's what we see in the Sahel. But at the same time, in Nigeria, where we have this long-standing problem of Boko Haram, has also really evolved the last 2-3 years. So over the last 2-3 years, we've seen basically a movement of some of those extremists from northeast to northwest Nigeria. And some of these groups, which is what we started to understand somewhere last year, some of these groups have moved to the border with Benin and are now present in a park called Kanji Lake Forest. And what we basically see is both from Nigeria and from the Sahel via Benin, those groups start to merge and start to sort of be in touch with one another. And this is sort of the basis upon which we started to write this report.
Right. So a lot of strange signals coming out of those regions. What do they indicate? What does this all mean?
So there are indeed like a number of really strange signals. And what this means is that we see some sort of a merger or a nascent merger happening between these two groups. And like long term, this is a real danger. So basically 2 fronts that were really separate, they start to come together, which means that also the responses that we have developed are not sufficient anymore. And we need to rethink the way that we engage with a problem like this. On the side of the extremists, the moment that they are able to sort of really claim this victory, of claiming this success of being able to merge and sort of move basically from the Sahel to the Lake Chad, that means a massive propaganda opportunity for them and claiming that they're really sort of the leaders of global jihad. That's one of the things that really makes this an important development.
So are there historical connections between northwest Nigeria and northeast Benin?
So, no, definitely, that's a really important point too. Like before colonial times, there were two major empires. On the one hand, the Sokoto Empire, but particularly the Borgo Empire, which was a social, ethnic, basically empire that stretches both in Benin and Nigeria, and particularly that second empire that's still really active. Like for example, customary institutions like chiefs and kings, they still hold power across both borders. The same, for example, hunting groups, so those responsible, tasked by the population to protect them, they also operate cross-border. So these areas, they should be seen really as one social area where people easily move borders and feel one.
Your report tells us that a well-developed cross-border trade system operates between the Nigerian and the Beninese border. I wonder what the impact of extremism is on the livelihoods of the people in the area.
That is, interestingly, I think it's the other way around. So what we've seen is that the government policies, both in Benin and Nigeria, they have put increased strains on the livelihoods of people in the border areas. On the Nigerian side, the cutting of fuel subsidies last year really sort of had an impact on the cross-border trade, because fuel in Nigeria is cheap and is often exported to the countries around it. And we saw when the subsidies were cut, really a plummeting of all of the informal trade, meaning many young men and women, by the way, were vulnerable and left sort of there vulnerable. On the side of Benin, because of different reasons, the Benin government seeks to make sure that everything that's produced in country, particularly cereals, stay within the country to feed the people, a laudable policy goal. But the effect has been, because they implemented a ban to make sure that cereals wouldn't be exported to Nigeria, the effect has been that also people can no longer trade. And both of these developments means that people in this area, that the livelihoods are really at risk. And this is the most dangerous part, because we see that violent extremist groups operate in the same area. So meaning that you have young men, young women without jobs, without livelihoods that can be recruited. And we've seen early indications of that.
So what then needs to be done to solve this very problematic situation?
So I think the key thing that needs to happen is to take advantage of an advantage that's actually emerging along that border between Nigeria and Benin, and that's the presidents of both countries. They go along pretty well. So Tinubu and Talon, they've developed good relationship, and that's the base upon which to start to address this. I think a key thing that needs to be done is that intelligence collections and sharing needs to start ASAP and intensify. Another thing that they need to do is to improve something that we call hot pursuits. So if you, for example, pursue a extremist group on one side of the border and they move into the other country, that you're allowed to go after them. So that's a key thing. So increased security collaboration. And I think the second thing that really needs to happen is that although all of these economic policies are understandable in their own rights, that there needs to be more awareness of the vulnerabilities of people in those border areas, and making sure that at least some of the burden is not exclusively falling on them, in order to really prevent those violent extremists from recruiting them.
Cas, thank you very much indeed. That's Cas de Bruyne there. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It's 18 minutes past 12 here in London. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now it's time for a roundup of the Latin American newspapers with Monocle's senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Fernando, I hope you're going to behave like a senior correspondent, because we've been sitting opposite each other today, and I'm afraid doing an awful lot of giggling, involuntarily sometimes.
Oh my God, I couldn't control. I couldn't control myself. But then, you know what? When you laugh, actually, you gain years in life, because it's healthy. But I do have this problem. You're very funny, Georgina.
Well, I have to say, at this rate, both of us are going to live to about 112.
Oh, yes.
Let's start, though, with some serious news. And we're actually looking at Argentina.
Let's look at the Argentinian press, La Nación. So Javier Milei is currently in Europe. Today he's in the Czech Republic. He left Germany yesterday. It's been an eventful, weekend for him, of course. He's a very controversial character, self-described anarcho-capitalist. He had a fairly decent chat with German's Chancellor Olaf Scholz. They're not naturally bad fellows because, they're from completely different spectrums ideologically. But they had interesting conversations about minerals as well, because Argentina has a vast kind of stores of lithium, so there might be some economic opportunities in there. But let's talk a little bit about the controversy, shall we? About a month ago, Javier Milei, he basically called Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister's wife, corrupt. That was, quite shocking to talk about this, about the wife of a leader. So he was indeed in Madrid, but no one from the Socialist Party or Pedro Sanchez met Milei. So they definitely snubbed him. And it's interesting because Argentina and Spain, they are, connected through years of history and, of course, in commerce, among other things. So that spat is still very much going on at the moment.
And of course there's so much controversy about him generally, his whole election campaign with his chainsaw and all the rest of it, talking to his dead dogs.
It is, yeah, he's a bit of a mad character. Having said that, some parts of the international press, including The Economist this weekend, they had an editorial it was mildly positive about Milei. They said, that he did some actually good things for the Argentinian economy that were very much needed. But as I said, mildly positive, not entirely positive. There's still some aspects of his policies that, most of the international media are very much against.
Well, let's continue looking at the economy in Latin America, because the real, which is Brazil's currency, celebrates 30 years.
And that's a big date. I think the Plano Real, I remember, that's the cover story of Veja, or a best-selling news weekly magazine. I was very young, it was 94, but I remember how the country was so optimistic after so much crisis after another. We've changed currency very frequently, Georgina. So that's actually the longest currency that Brazil had since 1942. It brought stability to the country. So there's been a lot of opinion pieces about it, saying how Brazil is what it is today. In a way, a much better country than 30 years ago, I would say, thanks to the Plano Real. At the same time, Folha de São Paulo reported in this special coverage of the 30 years that the currency did lost its value by 43%. So it's not as strong as when it was launched. I remember when in 94, the real and the dollar, they were very much the same level. So they were as strong as each other, but it's definitely not the case now. So there's still some things to fix, but it's been a very important, economic moment in Brazil.
Yeah. Now, while Europe, or at least some people in Europe, are paying attention to the Euros, the Copa America is underway too. That's hosted in the US, and Brazil plays tonight, trying to look for another identity. Tell us what that means.
Yes. Well, I'm sure you're going to be watching with me. It's actually going to be 2 a.m. local time, Brazil and Costa Rica. No, but let's be serious here for a moment. Copa America has always been criticized as, as the poor cousin of the Euros in a way. I mean, it's inevitable. We have less countries than Europe, of course, but also I think was their own fault, because sometimes it's supposed to happen every 4 years. But the scheduling didn't make sense. I think sometimes they did every 2 years. It was very confusing. So I think the CONMEBOL, the organization behind Copa America, they want to be a little bit more serious. And they said actually it's a good time to do it at the same time as the Euros. Every 4 years, it's being hosted in the US, which is going to host the World Cup as well. So it's a good test for the country. And you know what? I would argue as well, if you are a football fan, sure, we are not as big as the Euros, and I don't think we'll ever be, just size-wise. But look at the countries. You have Brazil, we won 5 World Cups, Georgina. Apparently we're the best football team in the world, I have to say that. But you have Argentina, Uruguay. It's the oldest football tournament in the world. So I think you can play around. I think you should do better advertising about the event. It's a very important one. I think if you're a fan of football, you have to watch Copa America.
But doesn't it divide the audience, having it at the same time as the Euros?
A little bit, actually. That's a very good question. But the thing is, they are all at different times because of time zones. Purely as simple. So I think it's just more matches for the crowd to see. But yeah, it would never be at the same time. So in that sense, I think it's okay. But yeah, that's actually a very good question.
And if you couldn't care less about football, what should you watch?
Then you have a glass of wine, Then you have a glass of wine. There's always events around it where you can play around. But yeah, I feel that you don't like football, Georgina, you're in trouble this summer.
I really am. Fernando, thank you. Fernando Augusto Pacheco there. And this is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Finally, on today's show, on Saturday, Monocle hosted a Swiss summer market at Midori House in London. Tyler Brûlé and I caught up with Andreas Nef, an international market manager from Travel Switzerland. Tyler began by describing how the Swiss travel app works.
I'm going to open my app right now. And, it's one of the amazing things, Georgina, when you've spent time in Switzerland. And of course, it's not just a recent thing, but it's incredible how, of course, Switzerland has built up exactly that, a system which is so integrated, from boats to chairlifts to getting on trams to getting on trains. And then the overlay or the underlay of also the digital applications that go with it, which is amazing. And it's always one of these wonderful things, because there is this app which you get from SBB, the Swiss Federal Railways, and you just slide into the system, and you might start on a bus, then you get on a tram, and you get on another bus, and then you get on a long distance train, and then you get on another tram and you get to Geneva, and then you slide out, and it's calculated at the best possible price for you. And people just think it's like wizardry and magic. So wonderful to have you here. Is it sort of a point of convincing people sometimes that this type of system actually exists?
Yeah, well, we are very spoiled in Switzerland. We have this marvelous system, and people wouldn't believe that you can actually live in a country without having a car. But in Switzerland, it's absolutely possible. You can reach almost every place by public transport.
It's true, but I like having my car in Switzerland as well, but that's a side issue. Just tell us, because it is one of the remarkable things. Many countries, of course, do have great infrastructure. They've invested in infrastructure over the decade, century. We can really talk in terms of centuries with Switzerland, but what makes the Swiss system so unique? Because you can say, yes, Japan's got great infrastructure. You can say that the Dutch have good infrastructure, but what makes Swiss infrastructure and the transport system so iconic in a way?
Well, I think the big advantage is that Switzerland is small. It's really rather small, so we didn't have to build hundreds of thousands of kilometers of railway. That's one thing. The other thing is that the various public transport companies are actually talking to each other. They are coordinating, they are working together, they make the timetables synchronized, easy connections, and that's the secret behind, I'd say. And well, the Swiss, they always try to find a consensus. They always try to find a solution which works for everybody. Yeah, that's how it is.
But it's also one of the interesting things, because there is a mindset component to it, and there is a point of national pride, Georgina, as well. I mean, I think you see this as well, and I think you mentioned the timetable. I can't think of any other country in the world where, when the timetable change comes about, it's front page news. I mean, the whole country is sort of celebrating or moaning about the fact, okay, that, this service, the time is now changed, that the train was supposed to leave, every day at 7 minutes, past the hour. Now it's 9 minutes past the hour. Wait, what does this mean? And it's kind of incredible, isn't it?
It absolutely is. The other thing that really fascinates me is the price, because it's not extortionate as you would find here in Britain. How do you manage to kind of keep that so it's affordable for everybody, but yet you still have the funds to run these things
and invest?
Well? Yeah,
well, I'd say the government is supporting public transport very much. When you look at, how much money the government is spending every year per capita, we are quite high up in the ranking in Europe. And I think that
globally
probably. And I think that's one of the very important keys to this system. Yeah.
And when you look forward, and also when you look at sort of filling in the gaps, of course, Switzerland's done an amazing job, but where is the room for improvement, would you say? Either geographically or in terms of maybe some bits of infrastructure that might still be missing? What's on the dream list?
At the moment, the biggest challenge is capacity. Well, the population in Switzerland is growing year by year. More and more people are still using public transport year by year. So really to cope with the demand, that's at the moment the big challenge. What you always have to keep in mind that there is only one set of railway tracks, which goods trains are using, intercity trains are using, local trains are using the same tracks. In most other countries, you have separate tracks for high-speed trains and for goods trains, but not in Switzerland, and that's another very big challenge. So most of the investment goes into getting higher capacities.
And just to tell us before we go, how much convincing has to happen when it comes to tourists, because we've had to implement something in our own company. Georgina, you need to be aware of this next time you visit. We're not paying expenses anymore to our staff if they take a taxi from the airport, because they don't have to, and it's so easy. But I think it's this point of actually convincing people how easy it is. And so, of course, people know to take the train in Switzerland, but is there a bit of a jump to actually get them to take local public transport, because that's often a pain point in so many cities around the world. But in Switzerland, you get on a train and it's immaculate and it runs to the second. So yeah, from an inbound tourism point of view, do you have quite a bit of work to do, or is it an easy sell?
That really depends on the market. I mean, here in the UK, people are quite aware of Switzerland and how the public transport works, etc. Though you still have to explain them how easy it is. They wouldn't expect such a good system, right?
Correct.
But when you, for example, go to the US or Australia, you would need to explain that there is public transport and public transport works. That's really, you have to do some work to convince people.
That was Andreas Nef of Travel Switzerland, and that interview was recorded live at our Swiss summer market at Midori House on Saturday. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Chris Chermak. Our researcher was Gunnar Grunlid, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.